There were a few reasons that I was very excited to read this book. It is a ghost story, which I think is really fun. It is about a middle-aged protagonist, which I really loved because I am sick to death of fantasy protagonists always being 17. And it's set in two periods of time. One in the period of Japanese occupation of Hong Kong during World War II. And then there's a time jump of about 30 years. And then it's set also in Hong Kong while it is a British protectorate in the 70s. And those periods were such fertile ground for ghosts and really complex storytelling by people with very complicated sets of loyalties. And so I was very, very excited to get my hands on a digital ARC, and I can't wait to share it with you. I think I'm going to split this review in very traditional review categories. So I'm going to start just telling you a little bit about the plot, and then later in the video I will get to character and narrative play. This book does a lot of really interesting playing with narrative perspectives, which I love. And then I'll talk about the themes and the resolution and how satisfying I found the ending. The first third of the book is told from the perspective of Mercy Chan, who is a middle-aged woman living in Hong Kong and in a very specific neighborhood of Hong Kong called Kowloon, which is the walled city. It is a very poor neighborhood and it is haunted by many ghosts. And so the areas around it, the richer areas around it, have walled it into itself. And as a result, it has grown up. And so it presents this really lovely, claustrophobic, urban fantasy setting. And Mercy has lived in Kowloon basically as long as she can remember. She has no memory of her life before the age of 20. She woke up floating off the shore of Hong Kong in the ocean and basically made her way to Kowloon and was able to eventually find a job and survive because she has this wonderful skill as a ghost talker. She rises through the ranks of the gang that controls the neighborhood and becomes the right-hand woman to the gang's leader, Cobra Lily. And all of that happened before the book starts. So we jump right in to 1975 when some people, outside developers, want to bulldoze the neighborhood of Kowloon and, redevelop it into more profitable or more lucrative, development. Basically, some of the local government officials who are supporting the redevelopment efforts accuse Cobra Lily of failing to control the ghost problem in the neighborhood, and specifically they point to a series of unsolved murders that have been happening recently as their justification for bulldozing the neighborhood. So Mercy's basic goal at the beginning of the book is to solve these murders and save the neighborhood. The book then jumps significantly back in time to 1941, to the days right before the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong. And we then follow a young woman named Suyen and her mother as they flee Hong Kong on a small boat, trying to return to the island where her mother was a child. And the island is completely abandoned by humans and haunted by ghosts, which creates another wonderfully isolated and claustrophobic setting for the ghost stories to play out. Once they reach the island, Suyen and her mother start to be drawn into the island's grisly past, and eventually what they discover there has reverberations through time all the way back up to the 70s when we meet up with Mercy's story. So turning to the setting, as I alluded before, I think the choice of the two key settings here, this, Kowloon, this poor vertical neighborhood, walled city, and then this abandoned haunted island, both are really wonderful settings for ghost stories. They both give you the sense of the characters being isolated from the broader world and very much on their own. And they also, I think, create good settings where you can believe that there might still be ghosts. I think it's nice when this kind of fantasy story, where it's basically like our world but with a little bit of magic, has a setting where it makes it plausible that I, as the reader, might not have heard about these ghosts. You could imagine if it was this poor, isolated neighborhood in Hong Kong, and, the outside world derided it as being, just overly superstitious, or, this abandoned haunted island. Both of those are settings where you can kind of imagine there might be ghosts, even set in basically still our world. But I thought those settings were also really wonderful because there's such a rich history in Hong Kong. So just a little bit of info background that I found on Wikipedia. Hong Kong was a crown colony under British rule from 1941 until 1981, except for this brief period of Japanese occupation during World War II, which lasted about 4 years. 3 years and 8 months. And Hong Kong was originally ceded to the British sort of as a concession as part of the Opium Wars when wealthy British trading companies like the East India Trading Company wanted to be able to sell opium to China. And obviously opium is hellishly addictive, and so the Chinese government had outlawed it. And the British basically sent in their army and navy to forcibly require China to legalize opium. And among the other things that the British sort of extracted from China was Hong Kong as a British protectorate. And the British basically controlled Hong Kong from all the way from the 1800s until they ceded sovereignty of it to China in the 80s. But during the period of World War II, the Japanese invaded, and the British governor at the time surrendered the territory of Hong Kong to the Japanese. And during that period of Japanese occupation, the population of Hong Kong decreased from 1.6 million to about 600,000 due to a combination of disease and malnutrition and deportations and murders, obviously. So a very traumatic period in history, and also a period where there's real fertile ground for storytelling, and particularly ghost stories, because there were a lot of people who died unjust deaths during that time, and you can imagine their ghosts having a thing or two to say about it. It also creates a really interesting setting because obviously there are all these shifting alliances. So you have people, for instance, who were locals, Hong Kong locals, who ended up fighting alongside the British against the Japanese during World War II, because even though they were sort of being occupied by the British already, they were being occupied by the Japanese sort of on top of that. And I think the general sentiment was that they would fare better under British occupation than Japanese occupation, at least during the period of the war. And so you get all these very complicated sets of loyalties that the various characters and also the various ghosts in the story have. And I thought that was really wonderful. I also think it just has to be said that, any fantasy book that is set not in ye olden timey Lord of the Rings English countryside is always a breath of fresh air. Not at all to slight the Book Eaters, which I thought had a really fun, fairies in the mist, rolling English countryside fantasy setting. But even though we are seeing more and more fantasy books set in, a diverse variety of settings, I think notable examples for me have been the City of Brass series, which drew on Egyptian magical lore, and the Bear and the Nightingale series, which drew on Russian folklore and magical tradition. But even so, I just always appreciate when authors and publishers are reaching for just different kinds of magical traditions and settings than, what I think we have traditionally seen a lot of. And one sort of final note I wanted to say about, this is not exactly about the setting, but about the sort of gore level. I thought this book did a very good job communicating the pathos of occupation and war and the horrors and the trauma without falling over into the sort of trauma porn bucket. There have been a couple of books that I've read. The one that always comes to mind for me is R.F. Kuang's Poppy War series. I read the first book, and I just found it too explicitly gruesome and grisly that I didn't feel interested in continuing. And I think books talking about war obviously have to walk a very fine line because war is unbelievably horrific. And I thought this book did a good job of communicating that without traumatizing you as the reader. So also appreciated that. Then turning to the characters, as I said before, love a middle-aged protagonist. Mercy Chan is She's described as like comfortably chubby and sort of proud of it after an early life of poverty and struggling to put food on the table. So I thought that was wonderful. She also, in her work, rather than forcibly exorcising ghosts, which is the sort of traditional way of handling them, she is a ghost talker. So she communicates with them and helps them work through their issues and be able to find peace to move on. And I loved that. I loved the vision of a protagonist who is not just here to fight the good fight, but she's here to sort of engage and therapize these ghosts and allow them to process their own issues in a sort of communal way. I love that her main superpower is talking. And I also thought she was just a fun character in terms of her personality. She's very down to earth. You know, she cracks jokes and cusses and just has a very warm, normal feeling persona. Then the other main protagonist, Suyen, is much more of a traditional fantasy heroine. She's, I think, in her late teens, early 20s, and, you know, is chafing at the monotony of her life in Hong Kong, and then flees the war with her mother and is excited for new adventure and, you know, wants to seek independence and just a lot of things you more traditionally find in a fantasy heroine. Unlike Mercy, who I found to be quite a surprising and fun, fully rounded character, Suyen, when things start to go south, I thought the way she reacted was much more of a sort of predictable fantasy heroine reaction. And I loved about this book, very similarly to something that I loved about The Book Eaters, her first book, which is that Dean really likes to play with morally gray characters. You know, nobody in her book is really innocent by the end, and she does a very good job of putting you in the head of the characters so that you sympathize with them and understand where they're coming from and are rooting for them, but without ever letting you forget that, no, this person is not right. Like, they believe this thing, they're seeing the world this way, and you are really sympathetic to that point of view because you get where they're coming from and you're rooting for them, but you know deep in your heart, and Dean never lets you really forget that, actually, no, this person is not, they're not acting like a good person. They're not, this is not okay behavior. And I really appreciate that because I love a morally gray character. I think, obviously, that humans are very morally gray, and fiction is one of the best places to be able to engage with that moral grayness because it's just easier to engage with harms that someone might commit in a fictional setting, obviously, than in real life where there are real victims, and it can be, I think, emotionally difficult to connect to the perpetrator of harm, you know, when there's like a real person being harmed, whereas in fiction, I think it's just much easier for people to access those emotions. And so I really love morally gray characters in novels, but I really, really do not like novels that forget that their characters are morally gray. I think novels that try to trick you into thinking this character that is acting in a really fucked up way is actually the good guy and you should be rooting for them and this is all okay. I do not like that. I think that can just be very lazy writing. Sometimes I think it can be much more pernicious. But anyways, I really appreciate in all of Dean's books that she does not do that. She has, I think, the book always has a great deal of moral clarity even when the characters lack it. And that enables the books to feel quite hopeful, you know, in this nihilistic hellspace that we all live in modern times. So blending a little bit from the conversation about character into the conversation about narrative structure because they're related, I think, in very interesting ways. This book plays a lot with narrative perspective, which, anyways, as I said before, that's something that I really love. I think is so fun. This book obviously is about ghosts, so you have all of these opportunities for people to just be constantly like being possessed and losing their memories, and you know, there's just a lot of play in the joints here. But the book has basically two main narrative perspectives, Mercy and Suyen, and then one sort of minor third character narrative perspective that wasn't my favorite, but that I can see the argument for having because the characters all keep being possessed and losing their memories, and I think it's good to have the third perspective is a sort of semi-omniscient character, and it is probably good to have someone who can stitch everything together for you, because none of the characters throughout the book really know what all is going on at any given time. You know, in an ideal world, I would have loved to see everything fit together without needing that, but I'm not like gonna be too harsh about sort of relying on that tool to carry it all off. And then, like I said, I thought the use of ghosts as a way to introduce these complexities of narrative perspective was wonderful. It reminded me a lot of Tamsin Muir's second and third Loch Tomb books, Harrow and Nona the Ninth, in the way that you had these characters who had sort of partial memories or partial understandings, or sometimes you had multiple characters, that you thought were maybe living in the head of one character, and you never quite know who anybody is. And that, I thought all of that was really fun. I also actually thought this book did a much better job than, certainly at least than Harrow did, of balancing retelling the same events from different perspectives and giving you new events. I think that can be a very difficult balance to find in Harrow. I ended up skimming some of the flashbacks because I just got bored, and I felt like, okay, I know what happens here. I've read a whole book in which these things happen, and now I'm reading a third of a book of flashbacks to events that have already happened that I already know about. And this book did a better job, frankly, of retelling you some events, but just the really necessary ones. So you sort of just got enough to be able to see where the narrative work was happening, and, the sort of difference in perspective was happening without it getting boring. So I thought that was great. And then the sort of last thing that I want to talk about are the themes. And I thought there were sort of two themes that I spent the most time thinking about while I was reading this book. One that I thought was really well executed, and one that I thought was a little more predictable. So the book is broadly exploring like cycles of harm, the way that someone who is hurt might take that out on other people, or might seek justice and in the process accidentally hurt other people, or be willing to sacrifice those other people as the cost of getting justice. And how do you ever break that cycle? I thought that ghosts was a fun way to take on some of those issues, because of course ghosts, unlike humans, are traditionally really stuck in their search for justice. Once you die, you're really fixed in a particular way, and being able to contrast that obviously with human beings who can learn and grow and can move past the harm that has been done to them and still have a life. I thought that was a great way to draw out the contrast between obviously the different ways that those kinds of harms can be reacted to. Then the sort of two main takeaway themes. The first one is this really interesting theme about living in the past and getting sucked into the past. When Suyen and her mother are on the island filled with ghosts, both of them are getting drawn into the past. They're being sort of tempted to be drawn into the past. And I loved that, because the idea of these two people escaping the horrors of war and going to this island, and then instead of being able to live their life, because life at that time was, did not have a lot of hope, and there was not a clear path forward, and everything was, scary and horrible, to just end up really living in the past and getting sucked into the memories of these ghosts and of this island, I thought was so reminiscent of the kinds of trends of nostalgia that we are seeing in our society right now. Idealizing the 90s and the analog trend, and the way that politicians always employ nostalgia for the past as a thing we need to go back to because, those were the good times and life is too hard and scary now. But obviously this book does a great job of showing you that that's a false promise. There's no such thing as going back to the past. The only way is forward. As human beings, you can only ever move forward. And if you try to escape the reality of your present by hiding in the past, it's just a sort of hollow, fake life. And so I really, really loved that. I thought it was very well done and very timely. Maybe they're like timeless issues, but issues that have been on my mind a lot in the past maybe year. And then the other main theme was this sort of letting go, you know, being able to accept that harms committed to you may not always be able to be remedied, and that you can't just seek justice at any cost, that sometimes the way to move forward, the thing that is best for you and for society at large, is not if every single person gets what's coming to them every time, that can just eventually cause more harm in the long term than, you know, doing the much emotionally more difficult thing of forgiving and moving on. And that felt more predictable to me. I think that's, you know, the kind of cycles of harm thematic resolution that you would expect, that I expect to see from a fantasy novel. So that one didn't blow me away, you know, but it was still good. I mean, it's still a nice, the book has not a happy ending, but a hopeful ending, and I appreciated that. So overall, I'd probably give this an 8.5 out of 10. I looked back at my review of The Book Eaters and I gave that a 7 out of 10. So I think, for me at least, from my perspective and in terms of my tastes, there's a big improvement from The Book Eaters to this book. I think this book is really well done. I thought it was very unique. I can't think of another book recently that I've read that's like a proper ghost story in the way that this one is. And I loved Mercy as a character, and I loved colonized Hong Kong, or occupied Hong Kong, as a setting, and I thought it was really well done. Sunyi Dean is a very good writer. I will say I felt that way in The Book Eaters, and I feel that way now. I read this in a day. I literally sat down on a Saturday morning and read it in 5 hours. So there was no point at which I was tempted to put it down. I really, really enjoyed it. The pacing was very good. It really pulled me along, and I would highly recommend this book. So check it out. Pub date in the US, I think, is May 5th. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video.